He spent his last dollar on a silent woman. What she revealed changed the Wild West forever. The last dollar. The winter of 1876 did not forgive anyone. Snow swallowed the mountains, turned rivers into stone, and made men forget mercy. In places like Crow's Ridge mining camp, kindness was considered weakness, and silence often meant survival. Elias Boone had learned that lesson the hard way. He stood near the edge of the camp, his boots cracked, his coat patched more times than he could count. His beard was dusted white with frost, and his hands, large and scarred, were wrapped tightly around a single silver dollar. $1. The last of it. He had earned it after 3 days of hauling frozen logs down a ravine where one wrong step meant death. Most men would have spent it on whiskey, cards, or a woman for the night. Elias Boone did not gamble. And he did not drink. The camp was loud, too loud. Men laughed without joy, fists slammed tables. Somewhere, a woman screamed, and then went quiet. Elias turned away. That was when he heard the bell. A sharp, metallic ring cut through the noise. Auction. Men began gathering near the central fire. Elias told himself to keep walking. This camp had already taken enough from him. But his feet stopped anyway. On a raised wooden platform stood the camp broker, fat and red-faced, his breath steaming in the cold air. Beside him stood a woman. Her head was covered with a rough gray hood. Her hands were tied. She was thin. Too thin for winter. Her dress hung loosely from her shoulders, stained with mud and ash. She did not struggle. She did not cry. She simply stood there. Last one for the night. The broker shouted. Quiet type. Strong enough for work. Doesn't cause trouble. Starting bid. $5. Laughter erupted. $5 for a ghost. Someone yelled. She ain't even worth the rope. The broker laughed along with them. Elias felt something tighten in his chest. He didn't know why he stepped closer. He didn't know why his fingers curled harder around that silver dollar. The broker grabbed the woman by the arm and pulled her forward. Look at her, he said. Still standing. Tough stock. The woman stumbled, but caught herself. She never lifted her head. Elias noticed something then. She wasn't shaking. Not from cold. Not from fear. $1. The words came out before Elias could stop them. Silence fell over the crowd. Dozens of faces turned toward him. The broker squinted. What did you say, mountain man? I said $1, Elias repeated calmly. Laughter exploded. $1. You insulting us. You think she's trash. Elias didn't answer. He just stood there. The broker spat into the snow. Anyone else bidding? No one spoke. Men looked away, not because they cared, but because they didn't. The broker shrugged. Sold. $1. Take her and be gone. The rope was cut. The woman swayed for a second. Elias stepped forward and caught her before she fell. For the first time, she looked up at him. Even beneath the hood, Elias could feel her eyes on his face. He handed over the silver dollar. The last thing he owned. As they walked away from the fire, Elias heard someone laugh behind him. Poor fool, a man said. He just bought himself trouble. Elias didn't turn around. He didn't know why he had done it. He only knew one thing. Nothing in his life would ever be the same again. The silent walk. Snow began to fall harder as Elias Boone led the hooded woman away from Crow's Ridge. Behind them, the mining camp slowly disappeared into the white haze, lantern lights fading like dying stars. The laughter, the curses, the cruelty, all swallowed by the mountains. Neither of them spoke. The woman walked a step behind Elias, her hands free now, yet she never tried to run. Elias noticed that most people ran the first chance they got. She didn't. The path into the mountains was narrow and steep. Snow reached their knees in places, and the wind cut like a blade. Elias broke the trail with long, steady steps, glancing back every so often to make sure she was still there. She always was. Her hood stayed low, shadowing her face, but Elias could feel her watching him. Not with fear, something sharper. Curiosity. After an hour, Elias finally spoke. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "You can turn back if you want." She shook her head once. A small movement. Definite. They walked on. The forest grew thick, pine branches heavy with snow. The world felt silent in a way the camp never was, clean, honest. At last, Elias's cabin came into view. It was small, half buried in snow, built from rough logs and stubbornness. Smoke curled weakly from the chimney. Elias pushed the door open. "Come in." She hesitated, only for a second. Inside, the cabin was simple: one table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed, and a fireplace that fought the cold but never quite won. Elias set his rifle against the wall and took a knife from his belt. The woman stiffened. Elias noticed immediately. "It's just the rope," he said calmly. He knelt and cut the cord binding her wrists. She pulled her hands back, rubbing them slowly, as if feeling freedom for the first time in years. "You're safe here," Elias said. "At least for tonight." He set bread, dried meat, and a bowl of thin stew on the table. Then he stepped away, giving her space. She studied the food, then him, then the door. Finally, she sat. She ate quietly, carefully, small bites, no waste. Elias recognized the signs. Hunger that had lasted too long. He turned his back to her and stirred the fire. That night, Elias slept on the floor near the hearth, his coat folded beneath his head. The woman stayed awake. He could feel it. The fire popped. Wind rattled the walls. Hours passed. Just before dawn, Elias heard her move. Not toward the door, toward the window. She stood there, looking out at the mountains, her hood still on. "Why did you buy me?" she asked suddenly. Her voice was low, controlled, not weak. Elias sat up slowly. "I don't believe people should be sold," he answered. Silence. Then, softly, she said, "That belief might get you killed." Elias met her gaze. Wouldn't be the first time. She turned back to the window. Snow fell steadily, covering their tracks, hiding Crow's Ridge like it had never existed. The woman pulled her hood a little tighter. "Men will come looking for me," she said. "When they do, they won't ask questions." Elias stood and added another log to the fire. "Then they'll have to climb a mountain," he said. "And mountains don't forgive easily." For the first time, the woman smiled. Just barely. The voice they tried to bury. Morning came slowly in the mountains. Gray light slipped through the cracks in the cabin walls, and the fire had burned down to glowing embers. Elias Boone woke to the sound of breathing that wasn't his own. The woman sat at the table. Her hood was still on. She held a tin cup in both hands, staring into it as if the answer to something terrible waited at the bottom. Elias rose quietly and poured more water into the kettle. "You didn't sleep," he said. "No," she replied. Her voice sounded different in daylight, stronger. As if night had been holding it back. Elias handed her the cup. Their fingers touched for a brief moment. She flinched. "Sorry," he said immediately. "It's not you," she answered. "It's memory." They sat in silence while the kettle hissed. Finally, Elias spoke. "You said men would come looking for you." "Yes." "Who?" She took a breath. "The kind of men who don't like witnesses." Elias leaned back slightly. "Witness to what?" The woman's hands trembled. For a long time, she said nothing. Elias didn't push. He'd learned in the mountains that silence often did more work than words. At last, she reached up and slowly pulled back the hood. Elias froze. Her face was not ugly. It was marked. A thin white scar ran from her cheekbone to her jaw. Another crossed her brow. Old wounds. Deliberate. Her eyes, however, were clear and sharp, blue like winter sky. "My name is Margaret Hale," she said. "And 2 years ago, powerful men decided my voice was dangerous." Elias listened. Margaret had once lived in Missouri, where she taught children how to read and write. Her husband, Thomas Hale, worked as a land surveyor for the Western Rail Authority. He was honest, she said. That was his crime. While mapping routes through the mountains, Thomas discovered something he shouldn't have: illegal land seizures, falsified claims, and miners killed for finding gold where they weren't allowed to. When Thomas tried to report it, men came to their home. They offered him money, Margaret said. More than we'd ever seen. Thomas refused. The house burned 3 nights later. Thomas survived, but barely. Margaret was taken. They told me if I spoke, she said, her voice steady but cold, they'd finish what the fire started. Elias felt his jaw tighten. And your husband? Alive, Margaret said. For now. Hidden in a church cellar 2 towns east. Watched. Waiting. Elias stood and paced the small cabin. That mining camp, they weren't just selling you, he said. They were hiding you. Margaret nodded. I learned to stay quiet. Silence kept him breathing. A sudden sound cut through the air. A shout. Then another. Elias moved to the window and peered through the frost. Figures. 5 of them, riding up the narrow trail. Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. They've found me. Elias turned from the window, already reaching for his rifle. How far is your husband? He asked. 2 days' ride, she said. Elias nodded once. Then we move. Before she could respond, a bullet slammed into the cabin wall. Wood splintered. Margaret ducked instinctively. Elias chambered around. No more silence, he said quietly. Not today. Outside, a voice shouted, Mountain Man. Hand her over and we'll let you live. Elias opened the door and stepped out into the snow. Rifle raised. Breath steady. You already took enough, he called back. A second shot rang out. The war had found them. Blood in the snow. The first bullet missed Elias Boone by inches. It struck the cabin doorframe, sending splinters into the air. Elias didn't flinch. He had lived too long in the mountains to fear sudden noise. Fear wasted time. He fired back. The rifle cracked like thunder, echoing through the trees. One rider fell from his horse, disappearing into the snow without a sound. Shouts erupted. Get cover. Gunfire tore through the quiet valley. Bullets punched holes in the cabin walls. Margaret pressed herself against the floor, heart pounding, but her face showed no panic, only resolve. Elias moved fast. He fired, shifted position, fired again. Years of hunting had trained his body to move without thought. Another man screamed and dropped his weapon. Outside, chaos spread. Horses reared. Snow exploded where bullets struck. Circle around. Someone shouted. Elias knew what that meant. He grabbed his spare rifle and slid it across the floor to Margaret. Can you shoot? He asked. Yes, she said without hesitation. Good. A shadow passed the window. Margaret fired. The glass shattered outward. A body fell. Silence followed, heavy, stunned. Only 2 men remained. They fled. Elias didn't chase them. He knew they'd run back to Crow's Ridge. He knew word would spread. The cabin was no longer safe. Elias bolted a satchel, gathering dried meat, ammunition, and blankets. We leave now, he said. Margaret nodded, already tying her boots. They moved into the forest just as smoke began to rise from the cabin. One of the men had lit it before fleeing. Elias watched the flames consume his home. He felt nothing. Not yet. They rode hard through the mountains, avoiding trails, sleeping in ravines and caves. Snowstorms hid their tracks, but Elias knew men like the ones hunting them didn't give up. On the 3rd night, they stopped near a frozen stream. Margaret stared into the fire. They'll never stop, she said quietly. Elias looked at her. Then we don't run forever. She met his eyes. You're talking about fighting. I'm talking about ending it. Margaret reached into her coat and pulled out a folded bundle wrapped in oilcloth. What if I told you? She said. I already have the proof to destroy them, She unfolded the papers. Maps, names, seals, signatures. Elias whistled softly. This could bury a railroad, he said. And everyone protecting it, Margaret replied. Elias stared at the fire. Then he smiled. For the first time in years. Then let's make them listen. The price of truth. They rode east before dawn. The mountains slowly loosened their grip, giving way to open land and frozen plains. Elias led the way, choosing paths that avoided towns, roads, and anything that left a trail. But the truth they carried was heavy. And valuable. By the second day, they felt it. The sound of hooves behind them. Elias raised a hand, signaling Margaret to stop. He dismounted and pressed his ear to the ground. 3 riders, he said. Maybe 4. Bounty hunters? Margaret asked. Worse, Elias replied. Men who know they won't get paid unless we're dead. They pushed the horses hard. By nightfall, they reached an abandoned trading post. The roof had collapsed, but the stone walls still stood. They hid inside. Margaret sat close to the fire, staring at the documents. All this death, she said softly. Because a few men wanted more land. Elias tightened the strap on his rifle. Because they thought no one would stop them. A twig snapped outside. Elias froze. A shadow passed the doorway. He acted instantly, throwing a burning log into the darkness. A scream followed. Gunfire erupted. Margaret fired from the window, her hands steady. Elias charged through the doorway, striking one man down with the butt of his rifle. When it was over, 2 bodies lay in the snow. A third man crawled away, bleeding. Elias grabbed him. Who sent you? He demanded. The man laughed weakly. Too late, he said. Your names are already sold. Elias released him. They left before sunrise. By the 4th day, Margaret grew weaker. The cold, the fear, the weight of constant flight, it took its toll. That night, as Elias wrapped her in blankets, she finally asked, Why are you doing this? Elias hesitated. Because once, he said, I stayed silent when I shouldn't have. Margaret reached for his hand. Then don't be silent now. Their fingers intertwined. The truth was no longer just paper. It was them. What survived the fire? The church stood at the edge of a dying town. Its white paint had peeled away, and the bell tower leaned like a tired old man. No hymns had been sung there in years. Elias slowed the horses. This is it? He asked. Margaret nodded. They keep him below. Out of sight. Out of memory. They led the horses behind the church and slipped inside through a side door. Dust filled the air. The smell of mold and cold stone wrapped around them. Margaret moved straight to the cellar door. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Thomas, she whispered. A lantern flickered to life below. A man lay on a cot. Thin, pale, alive. Margaret, he rasped. She ran to him, collapsing to her knees. Tears fell, freely now, unchecked. They said you were dead, Thomas whispered. They lied, she said. Just like everything else. Elias stood back, watching the reunion quietly. He saw the pain in Thomas's eyes, and the fire still burning beneath it. Thomas reached beneath the cot and pulled out a hidden box. They didn't find this, he said. Inside were original surveys, signed confessions, and letters bearing the seal of the Western Rail Authority. Elias exhaled slowly. This ends them, he said. Thomas shook his head weakly. Only if we live long enough to deliver it. A sound echoed above. Boots. Voices. They followed us, Elias muttered. Gunfire erupted upstairs. Elias grabbed his rifle. Margaret kissed Thomas's forehead. Stay alive, she whispered. Elias and Margaret fought their way out through the back, drawing the attackers away. Snow covered the ground again, always snow. By the time the shooting stopped, 5 men lay still. Elias was wounded. Margaret pressed her scarf against his side. You can't die, she said fiercely. He smiled faintly. Didn't plan on it. They escaped before reinforcements arrived. The next stop would decide everything. Court, newspapers. The truth. The last dollar. The courtroom in St. Louis was packed. Men in fine coats whispered nervously. Reporters sharpened pencils. Judges stared down from polished benches, unaware that history was about to shift beneath their feet. Elias Boone sat in the back row, his side still bandaged, his rifle left at the door. Margaret Hale stood at the front. No hood, no chains, no silence. Her voice carried through the room, clear, steady, impossible to ignore. She spoke of burned homes, stolen land, murdered miners, and a railroad built on blood. She named names. She held up documents. She told the truth the way only someone who had survived could. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Men turned pale. Some stood and tried to leave. They were stopped. When Thomas Hale was carried in, alive, the room fell completely silent. The trial lasted weeks. By the end, fortunes were destroyed. Executives were arrested. Land was returned. New laws were written. The West listened, and for the first time, it learned the cost of silence. Months later, Elias stood outside a small schoolhouse near the edge of the mountains. Children laughed inside. Margaret watched them through the window, her hand resting gently on Elias's arm. "They'll never know what you gave up," she said. Elias shrugged. "I didn't give it up. I spent it." Margaret smiled. In her hand was a silver dollar, worn smooth. The last one. Framed on the wall behind her desk, it read, "This dollar bought a voice that changed the West." Elias Boone had walked away from Crow's Ridge with nothing, and ended up changing everything. If this story moved you, remember, sometimes one small act of courage is louder than 1,000 guns. Right finger like this video. Right finger subscribe to the channel. Right finger and share this story, so no voice is ever sold again.